If you think the worst battles happen overseas, wait until you hear what this veteran discovered in his own backyard, with the help of a dog who refused to give up on him. The rain hammered against the windows of the small trailer in Bakersfield, California, each drop sounding like gunfire to Marcus Thompson's ears. He'd been sitting on the edge of his bed for 3 hours now, watching the storm tear through the mobile home park, while the voices in his head grew louder with each flash of lightning. 3 tours in Afghanistan had left him with more than just a purple heart and a limp in his left leg. They'd left him with nights that stretched endless and days that felt meaningless. At 52, Marcus had been home for 2 years, but part of him was still dodging IEDs on dusty roads thousands of miles away, still hearing the screams of his squad when that roadside bomb tore through their Humvee outside Kandahar. Staff Sergeant Williams didn't make it home. Neither did Private Martinez, barely 19 and always talking about the girl he was going to marry when his deployment ended. Marcus survived because he'd been walking point that day, 20 yards ahead when the world exploded behind him. The VA doctors had given him enough medication to quiet an army, Zoloft, Trazodone, Prazosine for the nightmares that came anyway, little orange bottles lined up on his nightstand like soldiers, but nothing could silence the voice that whispered every night that he should have died instead of those good men, that he was broken beyond repair, that everyone he'd ever loved would be better off without him. His wife Janet had tried for 18 months before she couldn't take it anymore. She'd packed her bags on a Tuesday morning while he sat in this same spot, staring at nothing, and told him she felt like she was living with a ghost. "You came home, Marcus, but you didn't really come home," she'd whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I can't compete with the war anymore." Their kids, Sarah, 24 and finishing her nursing degree, and Jake, 22 and working construction in Phoenix, barely called anymore. When they did, the conversations were stiff, careful, like they were talking to a stranger who happened to share their last name. Sarah had tried hardest, driving down from Fresno every few weeks until she realized her father couldn't give her anything but empty stares and forced smiles that fooled nobody. The disability checks kept the lights on and paid for the medications, but they couldn't keep the darkness out. They couldn't fill the emptiness that had settled in his chest like shrapnel, working its way deeper every day. Marcus had spent 23 years in the army, enlisted straight out of high school, worked his way up to sergeant first class, led men through hell, and brought most of them home. But he couldn't lead himself out of this trailer, couldn't find the strength to shower most days, couldn't remember the last time food had actually tasted like something. Night felt different, though. Tonight, the storm outside seemed to match the storm in his head and the pill bottle in his hands. Not his usual prescriptions, but something he'd been saving, planning, preparing for. Felt heavier than his rifle ever had. He'd written the letters weeks ago, one for Sarah, one for Jake, one for Janet, though he wasn't sure she'd even read it. Simple letters, telling them he was sorry, that he loved them, that this wasn't their fault. The trailer shook as thunder rolled across the valley, and Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every decision that had led him to this moment. In Afghanistan, he'd made split-second choices that kept his men alive. Tonight, he was going to make one final choice that would end his war forever. That's when he heard the whimpering. It was faint at first, almost lost in the storm. But Marcus had spent years listening for sounds that didn't belong, sounds that meant movement in the darkness, sounds that could mean life or death. This was different. This was pain wrapped in hope, calling through the night like a prayer in a language he hadn't heard in years. He set the pill bottle on the nightstand and sat perfectly still, listening. There it was again, weak, desperate, but definitely real. Not another phantom sound from his damaged mind, but something alive out there in the storm, something that needed help. Marcus pulled on his boots, the same combat boots he'd worn through 3 deployments, resoled twice but still solid, and grabbed his old field jacket from the hook by the door. The rain hit him like a cold slap as he stepped outside, soaking through his jacket in seconds. Behind his trailer, near the chain-link fence that separated his small lot from the abandoned land beyond, he found him. A German Shepherd mix, maybe 3 years old, soaked to the bone and shivering violently. The dog's left hind leg was twisted at an angle that made Marcus's stomach turn, clearly broken, probably from being hit by a car. But it was the dog's eyes that stopped Marcus cold. Dark brown, intelligent, filled with pain but somehow still holding a flicker of trust. They were eyes that had seen too much, hurt too deep but refused to give up hope. It was a look Marcus recognized, a look he'd seen in the mirror every morning for 2 years. "Easy, boy," Marcus whispered, his voice rough from months of barely speaking to anyone except cashiers at the grocery store and doctors at the VA clinic. "Easy there, soldier." The dog lifted his head slightly, ears perked forward despite his obvious pain. Someone had dumped him here, left him to die in the storm like he was nothing more than garbage. The thought made anger flare in Marcus's chest. Clean, simple anger that felt better than the numbness he'd carried for so long. Marcus had carried wounded soldiers before. He knew how to move carefully, how to support a body without causing more damage. The dog whimpered as Marcus slipped his arms underneath him, but he didn't snap or struggle. 60 pounds of wet fur and broken bones, trusting completely in a stranger's hands. Inside the trailer, Marcus cleared his small kitchen table and laid the dog down on a stack of towels. The animal was hypothermic, his breathing shallow and rapid. In the bright light of his kitchen, Marcus could see the full extent of the injuries. The leg was definitely broken, probably in 2 places. There were cuts on his paws from broken glass, and his ribs showed through matted fur. This dog had been on his own for weeks, maybe months. The nearest emergency vet was in Fresno, 40 minutes away on a good night. In this storm, with roads flooding and trees down, it might as well have been on the moon. But Marcus had field medic training. 18 months at Fort Sam Houston before his first deployment, plus everything he'd learned keeping soldiers alive in places where the nearest hospital was a helicopter ride away. He worked through the night with supplies from his first aid kit and makeshift materials from around the trailer. Cleaning wounds with antiseptic solution, stopping bleeding with pressure and bandages, fashioning a splint from a broken yardstick and medical tape. The dog never snapped, never growled, just watched Marcus with those knowing eyes, occasionally licking his hand as if to say, "Thank you." "What am I going to call you?" Marcus asked, as he forced small pieces of bread soaked in warm water between the dog's lips. The animal's tail gave the smallest wag, the first sign of anything resembling happiness Marcus had seen in this trailer in months. "You got that military look about you." "Duke, you look like a duke." Duke's tail wagged again, stronger this time, and something tight in Marcus's chest loosened just a fraction. He'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed by something other than his own demons. As dawn broke grey and tired through the windows, Marcus found himself stretched out on the couch, one hand resting on Duke's side so he could feel the steady rise and fall of breathing. For the first time in months, he slept without nightmares. Instead, he dreamed of a dusty road in Afghanistan where he was walking point again. But this time he had a 4-legged partner beside him, alert and loyal and unafraid. When he woke up 6 hours later, Duke was watching him with bright, clear eyes. The fever had broken. The dog was going to live. And for the first time in 2 years, Marcus realized he wanted to live too. But that was just the beginning of what Duke would show him. Over the next few days, as the dog's strength slowly returned and he began moving around the trailer on 3 legs, Marcus noticed something strange. Every morning, at exactly 6:47 a.m., Duke would position himself at the back window, ears perked forward, body tense with attention. He wasn't looking at the abandoned lot directly behind the trailer. His gaze was fixed on something beyond it, past the dead trees and rusted fence, toward a section of land that locals claimed had been empty for decades. Whatever Duke was seeing, whatever he was sensing, it was calling to him with an urgency that Marcus couldn't ignore. And in Afghanistan, Marcus had learned one thing above all others. When a dog shows interest in something, you pay attention. Military working dogs had saved his unit more times than he could count, alerting them to IEDs, hidden enemies, and dangers no human sense could detect. If Duke sensed something worth watching out there in that supposedly empty land, maybe it was time for Marcus to start listening again. Segment 2, The Discovery, 816,000 minutes, 2,000 words. 3 weeks later, Duke was walking again, not perfectly, but with the stubborn determination that reminded Marcus of soldiers who refused to be counted out of a mission just because they'd taken some shrapnel. The improvised splint had done its job, and while the dog would always have a slight limp, He moved with purpose and confidence around the small trailer that had somehow transformed from a prison into something that felt almost like a home. Marcus had started showering regularly again, partly because Duke seemed to prefer clean humans, and partly because taking care of another living thing had reminded him that basic hygiene mattered. He'd even called Sarah last week, the first time in 2 months, and while the conversation had been awkward, she'd cried when he told her about finding Duke in the storm. "Dad, you sound different," she'd said, her voice small and hopeful through the phone. "Better, like maybe you're starting to come back to us." But it was Duke who first noticed the pattern that would change everything. Every morning at exactly 6:47 a.m., the dog would abandon his breakfast and take up position at the back window. Not the front window where he could watch the street, not the side window with a view of the neighbor's yard, but the back window that looked out over the abandoned lot toward the rolling hills beyond. His ears would prick forward, his body would go rigid with attention, and he would stare at something only he could see. "What is it, boy?" Marcus would ask, following Duke's gaze across the scrubland. "What's out there?" All Marcus could see was 20 acres of nothing. Dead grass, scattered rocks, a few scraggly oak trees that had somehow survived California's endless droughts. The county assessor's records showed it had been empty since the 1960s, when some developer had planned a subdivision that never got built. Local kids sometimes rode dirt bikes through it, and Marcus had seen coyotes hunting rabbits at dusk. But there was nothing that should capture a dog's attention with such intensity. Duke would hold his vigil for exactly 7 minutes, then return to his breakfast as if nothing had happened. Every single morning, same time, same duration, same focused attention on that empty land. The curiosity began eating at Marcus. In Afghanistan, paying attention to what the dogs noticed had kept his squad alive more than once. Military working dogs could smell explosives buried 3 feet underground, could detect the scent of strangers who'd passed through an area hours earlier, could sense danger long before human instincts kicked in. If Duke sensed something worth watching out there, maybe Marcus owed it to both of them to investigate. On a Thursday morning in October, when the California sun was burning off the early fog and the temperature was perfect for walking, Duke made his move. Marcus had let him out for his usual morning routine, a careful circuit of the small fenced yard, checking the perimeter like the good soldier he seemed to be. But instead of returning to the trailer when he finished, Duke pushed through a gap in the chain-link fence and started walking with clear purpose toward the empty land. "Get back here," Marcus called, but the dog kept going, moving with surprising speed and determination for an animal with a healing leg. His tail was up, his ears forward, and everything about his body language said he knew exactly where he was going. Marcus had 2 choices: let Duke disappear into 20 acres of scrubland where he might get lost, hurt, or worse, or follow him and see what had been capturing the dog's attention every morning for weeks. The decision was easy. Marcus grabbed his water bottle, locked the trailer, and set off across the abandoned lot in pursuit of his 4-legged partner. The land beyond Marcus's property line was rougher than it looked from his window. What appeared to be gently rolling hills was actually broken terrain cut by erosion channels and dotted with gopher holes that could twist an ankle. Sagebrush grew in thick clumps, and the scattered oak trees provided patches of shade that felt good in the warming morning sun. Duke navigated it all like he'd been here before, pausing occasionally to sniff the ground or mark a particularly interesting rock, then continuing on what appeared to be a predetermined path. They walked for 20 minutes, climbing steadily upward toward a ridge that Marcus hadn't even noticed from his trailer. His legs, weakened by 2 years of inactivity, burned with the effort. But it was a good burn, the kind that reminded him he was still alive, still capable of forward movement. Duke seemed to sense his human's limitations and would pause periodically in patches of shade, allowing Marcus to catch his breath while never losing focus on their destination. At the base of the ridge, Duke stopped at what looked like nothing, just another patch of earth, slightly more compacted than the surrounding ground, surrounded by rocks that seemed randomly scattered. But as Marcus caught up and looked more closely, he realized the rocks weren't random at all. They formed a rough circle, about 6 feet in diameter, and in the center of that circle, barely visible beneath years of accumulated dirt and dead leaves, was something that made his heart skip a beat: a small American flag. Faded from exposure to sun and rain, torn at the edges but unmistakably red, white, and blue. Duke sat down next to the flag and looked up at Marcus with those knowing eyes, his tail wagging slightly, as if to say, "This is what I wanted to show you. This is why we had to come here." Marcus knelt in the dirt and carefully brushed away the debris that had accumulated around the flag. His hands were shaking, not from his usual anxiety, but from something deeper, something that felt like recognition. Beneath the flag was a flat stone, rough-hewn but deliberately placed, and carved into its surface with obvious care were words that hit Marcus like a punch to the chest. Tommy Rodriguez, Korean War, 1950-1953, never forgotten. A grave, a veteran's grave, hidden out here in the middle of nowhere, maintained by someone who cared enough to place a flag and carve a proper marker. Marcus sat back on his heels, staring at the stone, trying to process what he was seeing. Tommy Rodriguez, Korean War. Someone had fought and died for his country, and someone else had made sure he wasn't forgotten, even out here where no one would ever think to look. But Duke wasn't finished. The dog stood up and walked 20 yards to the left, where he sat down again and waited. Marcus followed and found another circle of stones, another hidden marker. William Chen, Vietnam, 1968-1970, brought his brothers home. And another. Margaret Sullivan, World War II, Navy nurse, served with honor. And another. Marcus spent the next 2 hours following Duke around the hillside, discovering marker after marker hidden beneath years of natural camouflage. Each one told the story of a veteran, men and women who had served their country in wars spanning 70 years, from World War II through Iraq and Afghanistan. Each marker was handmade, each placement deliberate, each inscription personal and loving. Some had fresh flowers, wilted now but recently placed. Others had small mementos, a Purple Heart medal in a weather-sealed plastic case, dog tags wrapped in faded ribbon, a photo of a young soldier in dress blues. Someone had been maintaining this place, caring for these forgotten veterans, and they'd been doing it for years. Frank Morrison, Vietnam 1968-1971. He started this place so no veteran would rest alone. Duke will show the way. Marcus found that marker at the highest point of the hillside, where a larger stone sat like a sentinel watching over all the others. The engraving was longer, more detailed, and as Marcus read the words again, his hands began to shake for a different reason. Duke, the same name as his dog, the same intelligent eyes, the same stubborn determination, the same instinct for leading people exactly where they needed to go. "You were his, weren't you, boy?" Marcus whispered, reaching out to touch the weathered stone. Duke pressed against his leg, warm and solid and somehow comforting. "Frank Morrison. He trained you to do this, didn't he? To find people and bring them here." As if in answer, Duke walked to a small structure Marcus hadn't noticed before. A shed, really, built from weathered wood and tucked behind a cluster of oak trees where it was almost invisible unless you knew where to look. The door was secured with a simple latch, not locked, and when Marcus opened it, he found Frank Morrison's final gift to his brothers and sisters in arms. The shed was organized like a military supply depot. Shelves lined the walls filled with notebooks, file folders, and cardboard boxes labeled with dates and locations. A small desk sat in one corner, covered with maps, newspaper clippings, and correspondence with what looked like county officials and funeral homes. Everything was meticulously maintained, dust-free, as if someone had been here recently. Marcus opened the nearest notebook and found page after page of names, service records, death certificates, and burial locations. Frank Morrison had spent years, decades maybe, researching veterans who had died alone, forgotten, unclaimed by family or friends. For each name, he documented their service, their sacrifice, their final days, and when possible, their current resting place. Many of the entries ended with the same notation: relocated to Morrison Memorial, honors provided, never forgotten. Frank Morrison had created an underground railroad for forgotten veterans. When soldiers died alone in VA hospitals, homeless shelters, or county morgues, when their families couldn't be located or simply didn't care, Frank found them. He researched their service records, arranged for their remains to be moved, and brought them here to this hillside where they could rest with honor among their brothers and sisters. The most recent notebook was still open on the desk, and the last entry was dated 6 months ago, right around the time Marcus had found Duke in the storm. Duke is getting older, but he still remembers. When I'm gone, he'll find the right person to carry on this mission. He always knows who needs to be here and who needs to find this place. Training a replacement has been my greatest challenge, but Duke will handle it. He always finds the right person. Marcus sank into the chair at Frank Morrison's desk, surrounded by the evidence of one man's lifelong mission to ensure no veteran died forgotten. Outside, Duke sat patiently in the afternoon sun, waiting for his new partner to understand what came next. For the first time since he'd come home from Afghanistan, Marcus felt like he had a mission again, a purpose that mattered, work that could honor the sacrifice of people like Tommy Rodriguez and William Chen and Margaret Sullivan. People like Staff Sergeant Williams and Private Martinez, who deserved better than to be forgotten. But as Marcus would soon discover, he wasn't the first person Duke had brought to this place since Frank Morrison's death. Segment 3. The Truth Revealed. 16 to 24 minutes. 2,000 words. Marcus spent the next 3 days immersed in Frank Morrison's notebooks, learning the scope of a mission that had consumed one man's life for over 30 years. The organization was staggering. Frank had identified more than 200 veterans in Central California who had died without family, without honor guards, without anyone to remember their service. He had successfully relocated 347 of them to this hillside, creating what amounted to a secret national cemetery maintained by one person's love and dedication. Each case file told a heartbreaking story. Vietnam veterans who came home to a country that despised them and died decades later in VA hospitals with no visitors. World War II heroes whose children had moved away and lost touch, leaving their parents to die alone in nursing homes. Women who had served as nurses, mechanics, and communications specialists, but whose contributions were never recognized, forgotten by a society that preferred to remember war as a man's game. Frank had documented everything: how he'd located the remains, how he'd navigated county bureaucracy to secure release of bodies, how he'd arranged for transportation and burial. He'd worked with sympathetic funeral directors, understanding coroners, and VA officials who shared his belief that every veteran deserved honor in death. When official channels failed, he'd found other ways. When families couldn't afford proper burial, he'd paid from his own pension. When red tape prevented him from moving remains, he'd created this hillside cemetery where he could ensure every veteran had a place of honor. The financial records were as meticulous as everything else. Frank Morrison had spent over $400,000 of his own money over 3 decades. His military pension, his disability payments, his savings from 30 years working as a machinist after his army service ended. Every dollar accounted for, every expense justified by his unwavering belief that no veteran should rest in an unmarked grave in a potter's field. But the notebooks revealed something else, something that made Marcus understand why Duke had found him in that storm. Frank Morrison had been dying, pancreatic cancer, diagnosed 18 months ago, aggressive and terminal. The final entries in his journal documented his desperate search for someone to continue the mission. Tried to interest the VFW. They say it's too expensive, too complicated. American Legion referred me to the county. County says it's not their responsibility. Contacted 3 different veterans organizations. They send donations, but no volunteers. Duke brought me Sarah Martinez last month, but she has young children and can't commit to the physical demands. Duke brought me Robert Kim 2 weeks ago, but he's dealing with his own PTSD and isn't ready. Duke knows what he's doing, but I'm running out of time. The last entry was dated 7 months ago. Duke found him, the one he's been looking for. I can see it in the way he watches Marcus Thompson's trailer, the way he positions himself every morning. This one is different. This one is ready, even if he doesn't know it yet. I'm going to have to trust Duke to handle the introduction when the time is right. My hands are getting too weak to write much more, but Duke will finish what I started. He always finds the right person. Marcus closed the journal and walked outside, where Duke was lying in the shade of Frank Morrison's headstone, watching the valley below with the alert patience of a soldier on guard duty. The dog looked up as Marcus approached, tail wagging once, eyes bright with intelligence and something that looked almost like pride. "You clever old soldier," Marcus said, kneeling to scratch behind Duke's ears. "You knew exactly what you were doing, didn't you? The storm, the broken leg, letting me find you right when I needed something to live for. Duke pressed against his hand, and Marcus could swear the dog was smiling. But as Marcus would learn that afternoon, he wasn't the first person Duke had brought to Morrison Memorial since Frank's death, and he wasn't the only one who had found purpose in caring for forgotten veterans. The first sign that others had been here came when Marcus noticed fresh flowers beside several markers. Not the wilted arrangements he'd seen on his initial visit, but bright marigolds and daisies that couldn't have been there more than a day or two. Someone else knew about this place. Someone else cared enough to maintain it. Marcus was replacing the small American flag on Tommy Rodriguez's marker when he heard voices coming up the hillside. Duke's ears perked up, but his tail started wagging. Not the excited greeting he gave Marcus, but the warm recognition of old friends arriving for an expected visit. The first person Marcus saw was an elderly African-American woman moving slowly but steadily up the path, carrying a small bouquet of flowers in one hand and a folding lawn chair in the other. She was maybe 75, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and the kind of posture that suggested she'd never backed down from anything important in her life. Behind her came a younger Latino man in a wheelchair, pushed by a teenager who had the same stubborn set to his jaw that Marcus was beginning to recognize in anyone who'd found their way to this hillside. The man in the wheelchair wore a Marine Corps t-shirt and had the kind of upper body development that comes from years of compensating for legs that don't work anymore. Bringing up the rear was an elderly white man with a Vietnam veteran baseball cap, walking with the help of a carved wooden cane. He moved like someone whose body had taken a beating, but whose spirit remained unbroken. Duke ran to greet them with obvious joy, and Marcus realized these people not only knew about this place, they'd been coming here regularly, probably for months. "You must be the new one Frank told us about," the woman said, extending her hand with a firm grip and a smile that reached her eyes. "I'm Dorothy Washington, Army nurse, Vietnam 1969 to 1971. Frank said Duke would find someone when the time was right." The man in the wheelchair rolled forward with a grin. "Roberto Sanchez, Marines, 2 tours in Iraq before an IED decided my legs weren't necessary anymore. This is my grandson Diego. He's the muscle of our operation these days." The older man with the cane nodded. "Bill Patterson, 173rd Airborne Brigade, Vietnam, 1970 to 1971. Don't let my age fool you, son. I'm still tougher than I look." Diego, who looked to be about 19, stepped forward with the kind of quiet confidence that reminded Marcus of the best soldiers he'd known. "My grandfather taught me that every veteran who served deserves to come home with honor. All of them, no matter how long it takes or how hard we have to work to make it happen." Dorothy set her flowers down beside a marker Marcus hadn't visited yet. "James Washington, Vietnam 1968-1969, beloved husband and father." Her husband, Marcus realized, watching as she touched the stone with obvious love. "Frank Morrison saved my sanity," she said simply. "James died at the VA hospital in Fresno 3 years ago. Lung cancer from Agent Orange exposure. Our children live back east, couldn't afford to come out for the funeral. I was going to have him cremated, scattered somewhere, but Frank heard about James through a friend at the VFW. He contacted me, offered to bring James here where he could rest with honor among other veterans who understood what he'd been through." Roberto wheeled his chair closer to another marker. "Sofia Sanchez, Gulf War 1991, Army medic. She saved lives." His wife, Marcus realized, seeing the way Roberto's face softened as he looked at the stone. "Sofia died in a car accident 2 years ago," Roberto said quietly. "Drunk driver ran a red light in Bakersfield. Her family blamed her military service for our problems, said the army had changed her, made her hard. They refused to claim her body, wanted nothing to do with a military funeral. Frank found out through a friend at the county morgue. He brought Sofia here, made sure she got the honors she deserved." Bill Patterson limped over to a marker near the top of the hill. "Tommy Nguyen, Vietnam 1970-1971, 173rd Airborne, Point Man Extraordinaire." The inscription was longer than most, filled with specific military details and obvious affection. "Tommy was my point man," Bill said, his voice thick with emotion even after all these years. "Best soldier I ever served with. Saved our squad more times than I can count. He came home from Vietnam with shrapnel in his brain and spent 40 years in and out of VA hospitals. Died alone in Stockton 6 months ago. No family, no friends except the nurses who tried to take care of him. Frank drove 8 hours to bring Tommy home, made sure he was buried with full honors. Marcus looked around at the 3 people, 4 counting Diego, who had found their way to this hillside and made it their mission to continue Frank Morrison's work. Dorothy came every Saturday to tend the flowers and maintain the markers. Roberto researched new cases, using his contacts at various VA facilities to identify veterans who died alone. Bill provided muscle when they needed to move headstones or clear brush, despite being 78 years old and walking with a cane. Diego, studying mortuary science at the local community college, handled the logistics of working with funeral homes and county officials. "We've brought home 18 more veterans since Frank died," Dorothy said proudly. "It's not easy work. Lots of bureaucracy, lots of red tape, lots of people who don't understand why it matters. But every veteran who rests here represents someone who served their country and deserves to be remembered with honor." "Frank always said this place could hold 1,000, Roberto added, gesturing toward the acres of hillside that remained unmarked. "Maybe more. But we needed help. Someone younger, someone with the physical strength to do the heavy work, someone with the passion to make this more than just a hobby." Diego spoke up, his voice quiet but firm with conviction. "My grandfather taught me that freedom isn't free, and neither is honor. Every veteran who served earned the right to come home, even if they didn't make it back alive. This place isn't just about the dead, it's about the living too. It's about proving that service matters, that sacrifice isn't forgotten, that brotherhood doesn't end when the uniform comes off." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 2 years beginning to crack and warm. These people had found the same thing he was discovering, that serving others, honoring the fallen, continuing a mission bigger than themselves, was the only real cure for the emptiness that came with surviving when others didn't. Duke sat in the center of their small group, looking from person to person with obvious satisfaction. He'd brought them all here, Marcus realized, each one found in their darkest moment, and led to this hillside where their pain could be transformed into purpose. But Duke wasn't finished yet. As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the western hills, the old dog stood up and walked to a section of the memorial that none of them had visited yet. He sat down beside a freshly dug plot, marked with a simple wooden cross and a handwritten sign that made Marcus's throat tighten with emotion. "Reserved for the next hero who needs to come home." Dorothy saw Marcus reading the sign and nodded. "We always keep one ready. Frank's tradition. There's always another veteran out there who died alone, waiting for someone to care enough to bring them home." Marcus looked around at the hillside, at the carefully maintained markers, at the faces of people who had found healing in honoring the dead. For the first time in 2 years, he felt something he'd almost forgotten how to feel. Hope, purpose, brotherhood. But the transformation was just beginning. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson stood in front of the bathroom mirror in his trailer, adjusting the tie he hadn't worn since his retirement ceremony 2.5 years ago. Today was different. Today, he was going to address the Bakersfield City Council, and he needed to look like someone they should take seriously. The man in the mirror was different from the broken veteran who'd contemplated ending his war 6 months ago. He'd gained 20 pounds of healthy weight, his eyes were clear and focused, and his shoulders carried purpose instead of defeat. Duke sat behind him, watching the preparations with the patient attention of a soldier who understood the importance of the mission. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had taken weeks of working alongside Dorothy, Roberto, Diego, and Bill to understand the full scope of what Frank Morrison had accomplished and what still needed to be done. Marcus had thrown himself into the work with the intensity he'd once reserved for combat operations, learning the bureaucratic battlefield that governed death certificates, burial permits, and county regulations. The first veteran Marcus had helped bring home was Sergeant Michael Mick O'Brien, a Vietnam tunnel rat who'd died alone in a VA hospital in Sacramento. O'Brien's story was typical of too many they'd encountered. Came home from an impossible war to a hostile country, struggled with addiction and PTSD for 40 years, died with no visitors and no one to claim his remains. The county was preparing to cremate him for a pauper's burial when Roberto's contact at the VA called. Marcus had driven to Sacramento with Diego, spending 6 hours navigating paperwork and regulations to secure O'Brien's release. They'd brought him home on a Thursday afternoon, and Marcus had carried the flag-draped casket up the hillside path with help from Bill Patterson and 2 Marines from the local VFW who'd heard about their work. "Welcome home, Sergeant," Marcus had said as they lowered Mick O'Brien into California soil, Duke sitting at attention beside the grave. "Your service is honored. Your sacrifice is remembered. You're with brothers now." That night, Marcus had slept better than he had since coming home from Afghanistan. He'd found something he'd lost in the explosion that killed his squad, a sense of mission, of brotherhood, of serving something larger than his own pain. Word had spread quietly through the veteran community. Dorothy's contacts at various VFW and American Legion posts began calling when they heard about veterans dying alone. Roberto's network of VA hospital workers started reaching out when someone passed away with no family. Bill's connections with other Vietnam veterans brought them cases of men who'd survived impossible odds overseas, only to lose their final battle with demons that followed them home. Each case was different, but the pattern was depressingly similar. Veterans who'd given years of their lives in service to their country, dying forgotten in hospitals, nursing homes, homeless shelters, sometimes on the street. Families who'd either abandoned them or never existed in the first place. County officials who saw them as paperwork problems to be processed as cheaply as possible. Marcus and his team had developed a system. Roberto handled initial research, tracking down military records and death certificates. Dorothy managed contacts with VA hospitals and nursing homes. Bill coordinated with local funeral homes and county officials. Diego handled logistics, transport, grave digging, ceremony coordination. Marcus had become the field leader, the one who drove to distant cities to collect forgotten heroes, who navigated bureaucratic obstacles with military precision, who stood at gravesides and spoke the words no one else had bothered to say. In 6 months, they'd brought home 43 more veterans, each one honored with a proper military funeral, each one given a permanent marker on Morrison Memorial Hillside. But the work had attracted attention beyond the veteran community. A reporter from the Bakersfield Californian had heard about the secret cemetery and written a story that went viral. Suddenly, Marcus was fielding calls from families across the country who'd lost touch with veteran relatives, from VA officials who wanted to understand their process, from other veterans who wanted to help. The story had reached the desk of City Councilwoman Patricia Valdez, whose own father had served in Korea. She'd driven out to see the memorial, walked the hillside with Marcus and Duke, listened to the stories of forgotten heroes who'd finally come home. When she left that day, she'd promised to bring the issue before the full council. "This isn't just about honoring the dead," she'd told Marcus. "This is about what kind of community we want to be. Do we abandon our veterans in death the way we too often abandon them in life? Or do we step up and do what's right?" Now Marcus stood in the crowded council chambers, looking out at faces that represented years of quiet dedication. Dorothy Washington sat in the front row wearing her dress uniform from Vietnam, still pressed, still proud after 50 years. Roberto had driven his wheelchair up from Fresno, Diego beside him in his best suit. Bill Patterson wore his Purple Heart on his jacket lapel, a visible reminder of sacrifice that demanded respect. Duke lay quietly at Marcus's feet, grey around the muzzle now, but still alert, still purposeful. The old dog had become something of a local celebrity since the newspaper story, but he wore his fame with the same dignity he brought to everything else. "The Morrison Memorial Veterans Cemetery," Marcus began, his voice steady and strong, "currently provides final resting places for 482 veterans who died without family or recognition. We've identified over 1,200 more across California who deserve to come home to honor instead of unmarked graves in potter's fields." The numbers told part of the story, but Marcus knew the real impact was in the faces looking back at him. Veterans who'd found purpose in honoring their fallen brothers and sisters, family members who'd discovered that service to others was the best way to heal their own wounds. Community members who'd realized that how a society treats its veterans, living and dead, says everything about its values. Frank Morrison started this work 30 years ago with a simple belief: no veteran should be forgotten. No service member should face their final battle alone. That belief has grown into something bigger than any of us imagined. Morrison Memorial isn't just a cemetery. It's proof that brotherhood doesn't end with death, that service continues long after the uniform comes off. Marcus paused, looking down at Duke, who seemed to nod encouragement. None of this would exist without a dog named Duke, who understood something the rest of us had forgotten. That healing comes through serving others. That purpose is found in honoring sacrifice. That sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign soil, but in the quiet corners of our own communities, where forgotten heroes wait for someone to remember their sacrifice. The council voted unanimously to officially recognize Morrison Memorial Veterans Cemetery, to provide city funding for proper roads and landscaping, to designate it as a permanent memorial worthy of the heroes it honored. 2 years later, Marcus Thompson stood at the podium in the newly constructed Morrison Memorial Chapel, looking out at a crowd of over 300 people who'd gathered for the cemetery's official dedication. The hillside that had once been empty scrubland was now a beautifully maintained memorial park, with paved walkways, memorial gardens, and proper headstones replacing Frank Morrison's hand-carved markers. But the most important things hadn't changed. Duke, now 11 years old and moving slower but still sharp as ever, still led visitors to exactly the right graves. The core team, Dorothy, Roberto, Diego, and Bill, still met every Saturday morning to tend the memorial and plan their next mission. And veterans were still coming home, one forgotten hero at a time. The Morrison Memorial Veterans Cemetery had become a model for similar projects across the country. Delegations came from other states to learn their processes. The VA had partnered with them to identify and relocate forgotten veterans. Corporate donors had funded expansion that would eventually accommodate over 2,000 graves. More importantly, it had become a place of healing. Veterans dealing with PTSD found purpose in honoring their fallen brothers. Families grieving military losses found comfort among others who understood their sacrifice. Young people learned about service and sacrifice from the stories carved in stone throughout the memorial. Marcus had been featured on national news, invited to speak at veteran conferences, offered consulting contracts with other memorial projects. But he still lived in his trailer in Bakersfield, still woke up every morning to Duke's patient watch at the back window, still felt most at home walking the hillside paths where forgotten heroes finally rested in honor. The nightmares had stopped 2 years ago. The medication bottles still sat on his nightstand, but he rarely needed them. The voices that had once whispered about worthlessness and failure now spoke of purpose and brotherhood and missions that mattered. Sarah called every week now, sometimes bringing her kids to visit the memorial and learn about their grandfather's new calling. Jake had moved back from Phoenix and worked part-time maintaining the memorial grounds. Even Janet had visited once, walking the pathways with obvious pride in what her ex-husband had accomplished. "I'm sorry I couldn't stay," she told him that day, "but I'm glad you found your way home." As Marcus concluded his dedication speech, he looked down at Duke, who was watching the crowd with the satisfied expression of a mission accomplished. The old dog had done what Frank Morrison had trained him to do: find the right person at the right time and lead them to the purpose that would save their life. Frank Morrison believed that no veteran should be forgotten, Marcus said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. That belief has grown into something none of us could have imagined. Morrison Memorial isn't just about honoring the dead. It's about proving that service continues long after the uniform comes off, that brotherhood survives beyond death, that one person's dedication can inspire a community to do what's right. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed and the sun set over the hills, Marcus walked the familiar paths with Duke beside him. They stopped at Frank Morrison's grave, now properly marked with full military honors and surrounded by flowers from grateful families. "Thank you, Frank," Marcus whispered, "for Duke, for this place, for showing me that the mission never really ends. It just changes form." Duke looked up with those knowing eyes, now clouded slightly with age but still bright with purpose. The old dog had saved more than Marcus's life. He'd saved his soul, his future, his ability to believe that broken things could be healed and that service could transform pain into purpose. That night, Marcus fell asleep to the sound of Duke's steady breathing, knowing that tomorrow would bring another opportunity to serve, another chance to honor the forgotten, another day in a mission that would continue long after both of them were gone. The Morrison Memorial Veterans Cemetery now serves over 800 forgotten heroes, with more coming home every month. It's become proof that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with love, dedication, and the unshakable belief that every life matters, every service counts, and no veteran should ever be forgotten. Marcus Thompson still lives in his trailer, but it's no longer a prison. It's mission headquarters. And Duke, though slower now, still knows exactly where to lead the people who need to find their way home. Because some bonds transcend death, some missions require a lifetime of service, and sometimes it takes a dog to show us what it really means to leave no one behind.